Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
Imagine sitting down to a Thanksgiving dinner in that familiar old house in suburban Ohio, where the air hangs heavy with the scent of roasted turkey and overbaked stuffing. The kind of meal that should bring families closer, but instead amplifies every buried resentment and unspoken obligation. Especially when your father suddenly raises his voice over the clatter of plates and declares with unyielding authority that if anyone dislikes the rigid rules he's imposing now that retirement has supposedly put him back in control, they can either take over the cramped laundry room as their new domain or simply walk out the door forever, a statement that lands like a thunderclap amid the forced cheer of the holiday. And while your brother erupts into laughter as if it's the punchline to some long-running family joke, you rise from your seat without uttering a single word, your heart pounding with a mix of fury and exhaustion, because for years you've been the one quietly ensuring that very roof stays over their heads through your steady financial support, only to be dismissed like an unwelcome guest at your own table. And now, just days later, that same father's voice comes trembling through the phone line with a vulnerability you've rarely heard, asking if you're still covering all the bills as if his earlier ultimatum never happened, leaving you to wonder how far the fraying threads of family loyalty can stretch before everything unravels completely, a question that pulls you deeper into a story filled with twists and moral ambiguities that might make you rethink every tense holiday gathering you've endured yourself. That particular Thanksgiving unfolded in our modest two-story home on Elm Street, the one my grandfather built back in the 50s with his own calloused hands after returning from the war. A place that had always symbolized stability amid the ups and downs of our working-class life, though by the time I turned 38 and found myself divorced with a 10-year-old daughter named Lily depending on me, it had become more of a financial anchor dragging me under than a comforting refuge. Because despite my demanding job as an accountant crunching numbers for a local firm from dawn until late evenings, I had taken on the invisible role of keeping my parents' household afloat ever since Dad's garage business folded under the weight of one too many bad winters and unreliable customers. Mom, Evelyn, had spent the day in the kitchen as usual, her movements precise and weary from years of managing the household on a shoestring budget, preparing the meal with that quiet efficiency she wielded like a shield against the chaos Dad often stirred up, while my brother Jake, who at 42 still floated through life on a tide of temporary gigs and unfulfilled promises, arrived late with a six-pack of beer and that perpetual smirk suggesting he viewed family obligations as optional entertainment rather than shared responsibilities. As we gathered around the dining table, its surface scarred from decades of shared meals and occasional outbursts, Dad Harold, a broad-shouldered man whose once imposing frame had softened with age and idle days, dominated the conversation from his position at the head, launching into a tirade about how the family dynamic needed reshaping now that he was no longer punching the clock every morning, insisting on stricter schedules for visits and contributions as if we were all still kids under his roof, his words laced with the frustration of someone who had never quite adjusted to the loss of his daily purpose. And when he turned his pointed gaze toward me, criticizing how my focus on my career and Lily's needs had made me distant from the daily grind at home, the tension thickened like gravy left too long on the stove. "If you don't like the rules, Camila," he bellowed, his fist thumping the table hard enough to rattle the silverware and send a ripple through Mom's carefully arranged centerpiece of autumn leaves and candles, "the laundry room's yours, or the door," a declaration that hung in the air like smoke from a backfired engine, underscoring years of my silent sacrifices, from wiring monthly payments for their mortgage and utilities to covering unexpected medical deductibles without fanfare, all while Jake nodded along with feigned agreement, his chuckle erupting loud and mocking as he shoveled mashed potatoes into his mouth, clearly relishing the moment because it deflected attention from his own lack of contribution, leaving Mom to murmur awkwardly about needing more cranberry sauce just to ease the suffocating silence. In that instant, with the warmth of the room turning stifling and the weight of unspoken resentments pressing down on my chest like an overdue tax bill, I felt a surge of something raw and unfiltered. A realization that my role as the family's unspoken safety net had been taken for granted for far too long, so I simply stood up from my chair, the wooden legs scraping against the linoleum floor in a sound that seemed to echo my inner turmoil. And without a word or backward glance, I walked through the living room cluttered with Dad's old car magazines and out the front door into the crisp November evening, where the streetlights cast long shadows on the leaf-strewn driveway and the distant hum of neighbors' laughter served as a stark contrast to the discord I'd left behind. The drive back to my small apartment 30 minutes away passed in a haze of blurred headlights and churning thoughts, my mind replaying the scene while Lily waited inside with the babysitter, her innocent questions about Grandma's pumpkin pie already forming in my imagination, and by the time I pulled into my parking spot, the initial shock had hardened into a quiet resolve, prompting me to consider for the first time what it might feel like to loosen my grip on the financial strings that bound us all together. The following morning, as sunlight filtered through my kitchen blinds and I sipped coffee while reviewing my own tight budget, Jake's text arrived with a photo of the uneaten pie slices arranged mockingly on a plate, captioned with some quip about how I'd bailed on the fun again, a jab that ignited a spark of what the heck defiance in me, leading me to access the online portal for their shared utility account, the one I'd set up years ago to streamline what I thought would be temporary help, and subtly delay the upcoming internet payment by a full week, knowing full well it would disrupt his endless sessions of online gaming and sports streaming without alerting anyone to my involvement right away. When his calls started coming in later that afternoon, laced with irritation disguised as concern about the glitch causing the outage, I let them go to voicemail, savoring the small, petty satisfaction of that first act of reclamation. A clever nudge toward accountability that felt like a long overdue exhale after holding my breath for so long, yet even as I savored it, an undercurrent of uncertainty lingered because family ties, no matter how strained, had a way of pulling you back in when you least expected. 2 days passed in relative quiet, filled with my routine of school drop-offs for Lily and client meetings that demanded unflinching precision, until my phone buzzed unexpectedly during a lunch break with a call from Mom. Her voice hushed and edged with urgency in a way that immediately set my nerves on alert, whispering through the line that we absolutely needed to discuss something critical about Dad. A hidden issue so pressing that it threatened to upend the fragile balance I'd just begun to disrupt, leaving me staring at my half-eaten sandwich as the implications began to swirl in my mind like autumn winds gathering force. Reflecting on that urgent call from Mom as I sat in my car outside the office, engines still humming and rain beginning to patter against the windshield in that relentless Midwestern way that always seemed to mirror my mood during family crises, I could trace the tangled roots of our financial entanglement all the way back to the sweltering summer 5 years earlier when my marriage to Tom crumbled under the strain of his endless overtime and my growing exhaustion from trying to build a stable life for Lily while he chased promotions that never quite panned out, leaving me to pick up the pieces with a divorce settlement that barely covered the down payment on my apartment and a resolve to never again let anyone's instability drag me down. Yet almost immediately after signing those papers, Dad's calls started coming more frequently, laced with hints about the garage's mounting losses from a harsh winter that froze engines and wallets alike, pulling me into conversations where his pride wouldn't allow direct asks, but the subtext screamed for help, and before I knew it, I had set up automatic transfers from my checking account to theirs, framing it in my mind as a short-term bridge to get them through until Dad's retirement pension kicked in fully. A decision that felt noble at the time because family had always been our anchor in the storms of blue-collar life, from the factory layoffs that hit Grandpa to the medical scares that sidelined aunts and uncles, but what began as occasional boosts for groceries and gas soon expanded into covering the mortgage payments and utility spikes without anyone batting an eye, especially not Jake, who treated the influx like manna from heaven for his sporadic ventures into selling refurbished car parts online, ventures that inevitably fizzled, leaving him back on the couch with excuses about market timing. Driving over to the house the very next afternoon after Mom's call, the wipers swishing rhythmically against the downpour that turned the familiar streets into shimmering rivers. I arrived to find her waiting on the porch wrapped in an old cardigan. Her face pale and drawn in a way that spoke volumes about sleepless nights spent worrying over bills she tried to hide in the back of kitchen drawers, and as she led me inside to the cluttered breakfast nook where sunlight struggled to pierce the gloom of drawn curtains, she finally handed over a thick envelope yellowed at the edges from being stuffed away too long. Its contents revealing not just the routine debts I'd been chipping at, but a cascade of collection notices from credit lines Dad had opened secretly against the house equity. Balances that ballooned into tens of thousands from loans taken to fund a string of ill-advised investments in everything from essential oils startups to a buddy's towing service that went bust overnight. All of it layered with late fees and interest that explained why my monthly contributions never seemed to make a dent, turning what I thought was temporary support into an endless sinkhole that had quietly eroded my own savings meant for Lily's college fund and the occasional weekend getaway we both desperately needed. Mom's voice trembled as she explained how Dad's stubborn refusal to declare bankruptcy or seek counseling stemmed from a lifetime of bootstraps mentality drilled into him by his own father, a man who viewed debt as a personal failing worse than any mechanical breakdown. And in that moment, hearing her confess that she'd known about the hidden accounts for months, but stayed silent to avoid his explosive temper, I felt a wave of empathy crash against the rising tide of resentment, because while I disagreed with her choice to enable the denial, it mirrored my own pattern of stepping in without demanding change, a cycle that had allowed Jake to coast even further, using the extra cash flow to buy rounds at the local bar and pitch half-baked ideas to Dad without ever facing real consequences. The atmosphere in the house thickened as the afternoon wore on, with Dad due home soon from his daily ritual at the senior center, where he pretended to tinker with model cars to escape the reality of idle hands. And Mom suggested we confront him together, but just then Jake wandered in from the garage where he'd been fixing his truck for the third time that month, his grease-streaked shirt and easy grin clashing with the gravity of the moment as he cracked open a soda and made a quip about how the rain was perfect for staying in and watching the game, completely oblivious or willfully ignoring the stack of papers on the table that could upend his carefree existence. Over the next hour, as we sat nursing mugs of weak tea that Mom had brewed more out of habit than thirst, the conversation meandered into the heart of our fractured dynamics, with Jake defending Dad's decisions as bold moves in a tough economy, while sidestepping his own role in encouraging those risks by borrowing against the loans for his schemes, his laughter light but etched with defensiveness when I pointed out how my post-divorce stability had become their safety net, a revelation that hung between us like the steam rising from our cups, prompting him to counter with that familiar sarcasm about me being the golden child with the fancy job, a jab that ignited a spark of what the heck irritation in me because for all his talk, he'd never once offered to contribute or even acknowledge the math behind my sacrifices. Seizing the opportunity for a touch of payback that felt as sharp as it was subtle, I casually pulled out my phone during a lull and texted a family group chat with a photo of the collection envelope blurred just enough to intrigue, captioning it with a wry comment about rediscovering Dad's hidden talents for finance. Anyone got tips on debt juggling? Watching Jake's face fall as notifications buzzed and cousins started replying with concerned questions that forced him to squirm and change the subject, a witty exposure of the hypocrisy simmering beneath his bravado that provided a fleeting sense of justice without derailing the deeper discussion entirely. Yet, even as that small victory settled over the room like a brief clearing in the storm, shifting the power just a fraction in my favor and highlighting Jake's complicity in the mess we'd inherited, the underlying uncertainty gnawed at me because Mom's hints about Dad's bigger secret suggested layers we hadn't touched, debts that might tie into health issues or past indiscretions he'd buried deeper than any toolbox. And as the evening light faded into twilight, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum, I gathered my things to head home with Lily's bedtime story waiting, the envelope tucked into my purse like a loaded question. The drive back was quieter this time, my thoughts churning through the implications of what I'd uncovered and the moral tightrope of deciding whether to tighten the financial reins further or extend one more olive branch. A dilemma that left me second-guessing my impulsive text as potentially inflammatory rather than illuminating, especially when my phone vibrated later that night with a voicemail from Dad himself, his usually booming voice reduced to a shaky whisper that sent a chill through me as he asked point-blank if I was still committed to handling the payments, because everything, the house, their future, maybe even the family itself, was hanging by that thread, a plea laced with desperation that promised revelations I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. Waking up to the echo of Dad's voicemail the morning after that tense evening at the house, with sunlight slanting through the blinds of my apartment in a way that did little to dispel the fog of unease settling over me like a persistent chill. I replayed his words over and over while brewing coffee strong enough to jolt me into facing the day, his voice so stripped of its usual bluster that it revealed cracks in the armor he'd worn for decades, prompting a whirlwind of emotions from pity to outright frustration, because how could he demand my unwavering support one moment and issue ultimatums the next, all while I'd been the one foregoing vacations and dipping into emergency funds to cover their escalating needs. A pattern that had started innocently enough after my divorce, but had since woven itself into the fabric of my life, leaving Lily to question why Mommy always seemed tired and why Grandma's calls carried that undercurrent of worry we both pretended not to notice. By the time I dropped Lily off at school with her backpack stuffed full of art supplies for a project on family trees, an irony that twisted in my gut like a bad meal, I had decided to head straight back to the house during my lunch break, driven by a mix of curiosity about Mom's earlier hints and a growing determination to address the sacrifices that had quietly reshaped my own stability. Sacrifices like skipping professional development courses to free up hours for overtime pay that funneled directly into their accounts, or choosing generic brands for our groceries so that their pantry could stock the name brand comforts Dad insisted on despite the budget constraints he never acknowledged. Arriving at the house under a sky heavy with the promise of more rain, the driveway still slick from the previous night's downpour and Jake's truck parked crookedly as if he'd rolled in late from whatever bar he'd haunted. I let myself in through the side door to find Mom in the laundry room sorting through a pile of unopened mail that looked more daunting than any engine rebuild Dad had ever tackled, her hands pausing mid-motion when she saw me. A flicker of relief crossing her face mingled with the exhaustion etched into lines around her eyes from years of mediating between her husband's pride and her son's entitlement. We settled at the kitchen table with mugs of the same weak tea from before, and as she unfolded the story of how Dad's recent doctor's visits had uncovered not just arthritis, but early signs of heart strain possibly linked to the stress of those hidden debts, I felt the weight of her confessions pressing down, revealing how she'd covered for him by rerouting some of my payments to specialists without my knowledge, a well-intentioned deception that now made me question every assurance she'd given about the money being under control, and in that vulnerable exchange, she admitted her own regrets about staying silent during Jake's teenage rebellions, choices that had allowed him to grow into a man who viewed family resources as communal without reciprocity, leaving me to grapple with the dilemma of whether confronting him head-on would heal these wounds or simply widen them further, especially since my instincts screamed to protect the fragile progress we'd made the night before. The real jolt came when Jake emerged from the living room, rubbing sleep from his eyes and carrying a laptop under his arm like it was a shield, his casual greeting turning evasive as he mentioned offhandedly a business opportunity he'd been pitching to Dad. Something involving flipping the house's equity into a down payment for a food truck venture that would supposedly get him on his feet once and for all, but as he talked, I caught glimpses of emails on his screen referencing my name in contexts that didn't add up, like co-signing documents I'd never seen, a scheme that twisted the knife because it exploited the very trust I'd extended through those automatic transfers, turning my support into leverage for his dreams while he laughed off my concerns at Thanksgiving, and the conflict escalated right there in the sun-dappled kitchen when Dad wandered in from his morning walk, his steps slower than usual and his expression darkening as Jake glossed over the details with that salesman charm he'd picked up from too many infomercials. Hearing the full pitch unfold, how they planned to use the house as collateral without fully disclosing the risks to me, banking on my history of bailing them out to seal the deal, I felt a surge of what the heck betrayal. Disagreeing with my own hesitation to shut it down immediately because part of me still clung to the hope that family intervention could steer Jake right. A naive choice that left me fuming internally at how his opportunism threatened not just their security, but my own hard-won independence, prompting a heated exchange where Dad defended the idea as a fresh start, while Mom looked on helplessly, the air thick with the unspoken truth that this could be the tipping point for all of us. Seizing the moment for a revenge that felt as pointed as it was playful in its subtlety, I excused myself to the bathroom under the pretense of a call from work, but instead fired off a quick post to our extended family Facebook group. A photo of an old family vacation snapshot from better days, overlaid with a caption musing about lessons in equity. Sometimes the house always wins, but who really holds the cards? Tagging Jake and a few nosy aunts who thrived on gossip. The wording clever enough to embarrass him by implying shady dealings without outright accusation, and sure enough, within minutes his phone started buzzing with replies that had him paling and stammering excuses about it being just brainstorming. A witty public nudge that shifted the dynamic in the room, forcing him to backpedal on the food truck talk while Dad shot him a disapproving glance, providing me with that satisfying rush of reclaiming narrative control amid the growing uncertainty. Yet as the afternoon light shifted and I prepared to leave for Lily's pickup, Mom pulled me into the hallway with a secretive glance toward the others, pressing a slim folder of documents into my hands that she'd retrieved from a locked drawer in Dad's desk. Her whisper urgent about how these papers detailed not just the proposed scheme, but something far more personal tied to the family's past, a discovery that promised to unravel assumptions I'd held for years and left me driving away with my pulse racing, the folder heavy in my lap like an unexploded revelation waiting to detonate. Staring at the slim folder Mom had slipped into my hands as I left the house that afternoon, its edges worn from whatever drawer it had languished in for years, and the weight of it feeling heavier than any stack of unpaid bills I'd ever sorted through in my accounting ledgers. I waited 2 full days before cracking it open on a quiet Thursday evening after tucking Lily into bed with her favorite story about adventurous siblings who always reconciled in the end, a tale that now struck me as overly optimistic given the fractures in our own family narrative, and as the pages unfurled under the soft glow of my desk lamp, they laid bare not just the outlines of Jake's food truck scheme, but a deeper betrayal in the form of forged documents linking my name to an early cashed-in life insurance policy Dad had held since before I was born. A policy originally meant as a safeguard for Mom and us kids, but quietly leveraged against to bail out Jake's first failed auto repair side hustle a decade ago, turning me into the unwitting co-guarantor through signatures he'd claimed were just formalities during a rushed family signing session I barely remembered amid the chaos of my own early career struggles. The discovery hit like a cold splash of reality, unraveling the illusion that my contributions had been voluntary acts of love rather than threads in a web of desperation spun by Dad's misguided attempts to prop up his son's prospects at any cost, leaving me to wrestle with a profound dilemma as I paced my living room floor into the wee hours, torn between the urge to storm back and demand explanations that could shatter Mom's carefully maintained peace or to wield this knowledge as leverage in a calculated push for accountability, a choice that made me question my own complicity in enabling the cycle through years of unquestioned transfers, because while I disagreed with holding back now out of spite, the emotional toll of continued silence felt like pouring good money after bad, eroding the independence I'd fought so hard to build post-divorce. Jake's call came the very next morning as I navigated rush-hour traffic to the office, his voice oozing that false camaraderie he reserved for when he sensed trouble brewing, inviting me over for what he billed as a proper family sit-down, to hash out the equity issues without the drama of social media jabs, a phrasing that carried the subtle threat of escalation if I didn't play along, and though every fiber of me wanted to hang up and let them stew in their mess, the pull of unresolved Questions about the policy and its ripple effects on our shared history drew me back to the house by midday, where the air inside carried the faint scent of Mom's baking as a desperate bid for normalcy. Her apple pie cooling on the counter amid the tension radiating from Dad's slumped posture in his recliner and Jake's overly animated gestures as he laid out printed proposals for the food truck on the dining table. Documents that glossed over the risks with pie charts and optimistic projections, borrowed from some online template. As we gathered around that same scarred wooden surface where Thanksgiving had exploded just weeks before, the conversation quickly devolved into a tug-of-war over trust and futures, with Dad defending the past decisions as necessary sacrifices for keeping the family engine running in an economy that chewed up dreamers like him and Jake, his eyes avoiding mine as he admitted the insurance maneuver had been a one-time Hail Mary to avoid losing the house entirely, while Jake chimed in with excuses about how market fluctuations weren't his fault, his hand inching toward the folder I'd brought tucked under my arm like it might vanish if he didn't claim it first. The growing conflict crested when I spread the policy papers out across the table, my voice steady, but infused with that dry humor I'd developed as a shield against their dismissals, pointing out how bold moves, like forging a daughter's name on financial lifelines, turned family bonds into liabilities overnight. A revelation that drained the color from Jake's face and prompted Dad to mutter about the pressures of providing in a world where sons like Jake represented the next generation's shot at stability, even as Mom hovered in the doorway wringing a dish towel, her silence speaking volumes about the vulnerabilities she'd shielded for so long. And in that charged atmosphere, with rain starting to drum against the windows like an impatient audience demanding resolution, I faced the dilemma head-on, weighing the satisfaction of walking away forever against the messy potential for reconciliation that might salvage something worthwhile from the ruins. Opting for a path that blended revenge with reluctant mercy, I agreed to co-sign the loan they so desperately needed, but only under the condition that we redo the entire family ledger right there on the spot, pulling out my laptop to input every transaction from the past 5 years. Mortgage wires, utility delays, even the forgotten reimbursements for Jake's gas money line by line in a shared spreadsheet that exposed his withdrawals and Dad's overlooked fees in stark numerical clarity, a process that stretched into hours and forced confessions amid the clicking keys, like Jake admitting he'd siphoned funds for bar tabs under the guise of business expenses, while I cleverly routed the approved loan amount into a new joint account with withdrawal limits only I could adjust, effectively withholding the excess that might fuel more schemes and turning their dependence into a controlled drip, a witty inversion of power that left Jake fuming quietly and Dad nodding in weary acceptance, the satisfaction of that manipulated gathering washing over me like a cool breeze after a stifling day, yet laced with the uncertainty of whether this clever containment would hold or merely delay the inevitable blow-up. As the session wound down and twilight filtered through the curtains in hues of deepening blue, casting elongated shadows that mirrored the elongated resentments we'd unearthed, I rose to leave with the pie Mom insisted I take for Lily. The air between us thicker than ever with half-spoken apologies and lingering doubts, but just as I reached the door, Dad caught my elbow with a grip surprisingly firm for his frailty, pulling me aside into the dim hallway where family photos lined the walls. Like silent witnesses to better times, his whisper close and urgent as he confided that there was one final piece to this puzzle involving Mom and the real reasons she'd never pushed back against his choices over the decades. A bombshell tied to her own hidden sacrifices that could redefine everything if I chose to hear it, leaving me frozen on the threshold with the folder's secrets still buzzing in my mind, and the drive home stretching ahead like an uncharted road fraught with more revelations than resolutions. Dad's whispered hint about Mom's hidden sacrifices echoing in my ears like a half-heard warning during the drive home from that exhaustive family ledger session, where the spreadsheet's unforgiving columns had laid bare every uneven exchange and forced admissions that hung in the air heavier than the rain-soaked chill outside. I wrestled through the night with the temptation to let it all go and focus on building a simpler life for Lily and myself, free from the gravitational pull of Obligations that had defined too many of my choices since the divorce, yet the unresolved pull of those untold stories tugged at me relentlessly, making me disagree with my own impulse to sever ties cleanly, because deep down I craved the full picture. The kind that might explain why a mother who'd baked comfort into every holiday would tolerate a lifetime of financial tightropes and favoritism toward a son who gave little back, a dilemma that kept me tossing until dawn when Lily's cheerful questions about the pie I'd brought pulled me back to the present, her innocence a stark reminder of why I'd fought so hard to stabilize our world amid the chaos of theirs. By the following weekend, with the holiday lights already twinkling mockingly from neighbors' porches in premature celebration of Christmas cheer that felt worlds away from our strained dynamics, I found myself driving back to the house once more. The folder from before now joined by a resolve to demand the complete truth, parking in the driveway where Jake's truck sat absent for once, a small mercy that suggested he might be licking his wounds from the controlled account restrictions I'd imposed, and as I stepped inside to the familiar scent of Mom's simmering soup meant to soothe whatever confrontation awaited, the living room gathering felt like the final act in a play we'd all been improvising for far too long. They were assembled there in the dim lamplight, Dad in his recliner clutching a small wooden box from his workshop that looked out of place among the scattered magazines and remote controls. Mom perched on the couch edge with her hands clasped tightly as if bracing for impact, and Jake slouched in the armchair with a defensive set to his jaw that betrayed his awareness of the shifting tides. His earlier schemes now curtailed by the ledger's revelations that had exposed his bar tabs and borrowed tools as drains on the family pot rather than investments, a transparency that had already prompted a few relatives to text me privately with concerns about his reliability. Adding to the growing conflict that simmered just below the surface as Dad cleared his throat and began unpacking the box with hands steadier than I'd seen in weeks. What emerged over the next hour shattered the remaining illusions I'd clung to, the contents revealing unsigned divorce papers dated 30 years back to a time when Dad's wandering eye during a rough patch at the garage had led to a brief affair with a coworker that nearly tore the marriage apart. Papers Mom had held onto not out of spite, but as a silent leverage to ensure he never strayed again. Her choice to stay rooted in the fear of raising 2 young kids alone in an era when single mothers faced judgment and scant support, a decision that explained her endless mediation and tolerance for his debts, because every risky loan and favoritism toward Jake had been her way of holding the family unit together through quiet endurance rather than explosive exits. A twist that gutted me with empathy for her unseen burdens even as it fueled resentment toward Dad for the ripple effects that had landed on my doorstep post-divorce. The atmosphere thickened with raw confessions as Dad admitted the life insurance cash-out hadn't just been a desperate fix for Jake's venture, but a misguided attempt to rebuild trust with Mom by funding a family trip that never happened due to more mounting bills. His voice cracking with the regret of a man who'd prioritized pride over partnership, while Jake shifted uncomfortably and revealed he'd known fragments of the affair story from overheard arguments, using that knowledge to manipulate Dad into leniency for his own mistakes, his laughter at Thanksgiving now exposed as a brittle cover for guilt over squandering the second chances meant to honor Mom's sacrifices. A betrayal that ignited the final confrontation as accusations flew across the room like sparks from a faulty wire, with me pointing out how their secrets had turned my support into a crutch for dysfunction rather than a bridge to better days. A truth that had Jake on his feet yelling about ungrateful handouts before I cut him off with the ultimate witty revenge, pulling up the digital ledger on my phone and emailing him a customized version right then and there, a mock family balance sheet tallying not just dollars but emotional debts like one lifetime of overlooked contributions, priceless, payable in accountability, complete with interest accrued from years of dismissals, a precise and humorous jab that left him red-faced and storming out the door with a slam that rattled the windows, providing that last satisfying click of retribution amid the emotional wreckage. In the stunned silence that followed, with Mom's eyes meeting mine in a moment of shared understanding that bridged decades of silence and Dad's plea hanging vulnerable, "We can fix this, Camila," stay, and let's try. I felt the dilemmas collide one final time. The audience of my conscience urging a clean break even as the pull of fractured loyalty whispered of potential healing, choices that made me question if forgiveness would chain me further or if freedom came at the cost of isolation, leading me to stand without a word, much like that fateful Thanksgiving, and walk out into the gathering dusk where streetlights flickered on like hesitant stars. The drive home blurred with the box's contents tucked under my arm and Lily's drawing of our perfect family waiting on the dashboard, a child's vision clashing against the ambiguities now swirling in my mind. The phone remaining silent in the passenger seat as if the family had finally learned the boundary of my resolve, leaving me to navigate the uncertain road ahead where payments might resume out of lingering duty or cease entirely in pursuit of self-preservation, a thought-provoking limbo that pondered whether some ties, once illuminated in their full tangled glory, could ever truly be mended or if the real revelation lay in the quiet power of choosing solitude over simulated unity.